Well, this is my colleague, David Kay. He's a senior extension associate with me in CaRDI. Has a great background in land use planning, energy work, community development. Although he's trained as an economist, we still let him hang out with us. But he and I are doing a lot of work on climate change-induced migration and perceptions of flood risk in the Hudson River Valley. I'm hoping he's going to talk a little bit about that, but we're really excited to have this panel. So, David, take it away.
Thanks, Robin. I'd like to also thank. I've helped out a little bit on this conference, but I'd really like to thank Robin and Heidi and the other folks here on campus who have helped us out, and our incredible partners with LISC and the Office of Engagement Initiatives for really making this a conference where I've already learned a tremendous amount, and we haven't even gotten to my favorite topic yet, which is this panel. So I, again, would just like to thank them and all of you for making this conference as good as it is. And we have a little slightly greater amount of time for this session than some of the other ones. We do have 4 presenters, though. We're going to try and keep them to 15-minute presentations. There will be interaction like we've had, but I'm going to work a little harder at trying to get you to tell some of your stories from your communities than maybe in some of the other sessions. So I have 1 or 2 people I know have some things out there who have some things to say. So if I don't hear from you, I'm going to be looking at you hard to make a contribution. We're going to have there is a logic to this session, kind of that was similar to some of the other ones, where we're going to start with Sam Magavern, who's from the Buffalo area, and he's going to really give kind of a more of a community-based perspective from his work, and then we're going to kind of work through our panelists. I'm not going to take a lot of time introducing them, but we're going to end up with Jamie as an academic at the end. And I am not going to really talk very much now about our own research, but I am going to just like try and frame this conference with the topically related research that we didn't do but was done very recently. And this is a very complex graph that's up there, but the key thing that I want to frame this conference topic session with is the headline there. Migration induced by sea level rise could reshape the U.S. population landscape. And what this shows is one of the first estimates that have been done by a demographer, Matt Hauer, of trying to estimate how many people are going to be moving from the state they're in and the community that they're in somewhere else only because of sea level rise. In the foreseeable future. And the green one, the dark green one, is New York State, inflow and outflow, and flow within the state. So the point here is not that these are going to be accurate data or accurate predictions, but really from my perspective, we're looking into a future that looks very different than the past, and it has enormous implications for housing. So that's all I'm going to say about it. We're going to turn it over to Sam. Please just like each of you introduce yourself in the way you would most prefer to be remembered by the friendly crowd here.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. I've learned a lot in the last day and a half and really appreciate being here. So I'm with an organization called Partnership for the Public Good in Buffalo. We're a community-based think tank. So that means we do research and advocacy on behalf of about 300 partner organizations in the Buffalo-Niagara area. Many of them are interested in housing, many interested in environmental issues, but they also include museums, faith groups, academic groups, all kinds of different partners, all the way from a block club to the United Way. So our job is to help them with research and advocacy and strategy and press and anything that helps them get their ideas and opinions translated into public policy. We are co-located with Cornell in Buffalo, and many of us work for both institutions. And one resource that we co-curate with Cornell that I want to make sure I mention to you, on our website at ppgbuffalo.org, if you go to the section called Buffalo Commons, That's where we house all of the research that we produce, but also all the research that we know about and can find that relates to the Buffalo-Niagara region. And although it's Western New York focused, many of the issues that we're talking about are issues that you face in your communities. So I think you'll find some of those resources helpful. So today I'll be talking about the Green Development Zone in Buffalo. We have a lengthy report about that you can find on our website. We have policy briefs about vacant lot greening. Many of the topics that are getting discussed here at this conference you can find at that Buffalo Commons website. So I encourage you to look at that. So I'm going to frame my remarks today in terms of climate justice, and that is the approach that our partners who are working on these issues at the intersection of climate change and housing, that's the approach that those partners have adopted. And I think for me, they're kind of two different versions of climate justice. One sort of basic version that I think anyone who kind of looks at the facts about climate change can embrace is the simple notion that the people who have contributed the least to climate change are suffering the worst impacts. Whether you're comparing nations or groups within nations, whether you're comparing people with high incomes in the United States to people with lower incomes, the people contributing the most to climate change are suffering the least, and the people who contribute the least to climate change are suffering the most, and those trends are only going to be exacerbated. So that's sort of what I think of as sort of the basic version of climate justice. The other version that our groups have advanced includes that, but it goes beyond that to say that the same political economy that leads to climate change and some of its worst impacts also leads to social injustice. So that the very same political economy that treats nature as a disposable asset to be monetized and extract all the value from and sort of leave your trash in the commons, that same system does the same thing to people, that it tends to extract value from workers and consumers and residents and monetize it and not sustain the community in a way that's viable long term. So our partners really have embraced that vision. You find it in a lot of places. You find it in Pope Francis's encyclical about climate change. He really uses exactly that same analysis. And that's the one that we've embraced as well. And so the sort of positive vision of it is that what we need is a just transition, that we're going to be moving beyond the fossil fuel economy, but that the way we do so matters immensely, and that we have to do so in a way that protects workers, that protects ordinary residents, that helps remedy some of these effects of climate injustice. Now, I'm going to be talking specifically about Buffalo, and there's a bit of a, the graphs like that have produced a little bit of discourse in Buffalo about the impacts of climate change and the fact that we're a cold weather city near a huge body of fresh water, and that maybe a lot of people are going to want to move to Buffalo to take advantage of that as other places become less desirable. So there's even occasionally, people sort of thinking that Buffalo will gain from climate change. And I'm extremely skeptical of that point of view. That to me would be like saying that the house is burning, but our room has air conditioning, so we're going to be fine. Or we're actually going to do better because everyone's going to want to come to our room where it's cooler. I don't think it works that way. One reason is that this is a planetary emergency and none of us are going to be immune from the impacts. Another reason is that Buffalo's economy is very tied to the economy of New York City. We rely very heavily on aid to local municipalities from New York State government. Essentially, the state extracts money from New York City area where revenues are strong and distributes it to the rest of the state, including places like Buffalo. When New York City faces things like Superstorm Sandy, revenues go down, costs go up in New York City, and we in Buffalo will feel the impact because there'll be less money to share with us. So that's one reason. But another reason that I'm very skeptical is that, particularly when we think about climate justice in the Buffalo context, and we look at some of the impacts of climate change on our most vulnerable residents, we realize how dire they can be even in a cold weather city next to Lake Erie. So let me give two examples, what hotter air does to Buffalo and what extreme storms do to Buffalo. So hotter air, so projections are that average temperature is going to rise 4 to 8 degrees Fahrenheit in Western New York by about 2080. One of the things that means is that our annual days over 90 degrees are going to go from currently we have about 4 to 8 days over 90 each year. That's projected to rise to between 27 and 57 degrees over 90. So you might think, well, 90s, that's nothing. Lots of places in the country have heat in the 90s all the time. But heat in the 90s is a real threat to cold weather cities because we're not prepared for it. Most of our vulnerable residents do not have air conditioning. And so heat waves are a big cause of mortality in cities like Chicago and Buffalo because we're not built for it, essentially. So the heat itself obviously is a factor, but the air quality problems that come with higher temperatures are a huge problem in a place like Buffalo. And particularly because our lower income residents and our residents of color have extremely high rates of asthma and extremely high rates of cardiovascular disease, which is the #1 killer in the state. And of course, hotter air, worse air quality, higher ozone levels is very bad for conditions like asthma and cardiovascular disease. So heat is a big issue in cities like Buffalo. And as we think about the future of housing in places like Buffalo, we have to think of how are we going to keep residents cool, both within their homes and also at a neighborhood level. What kind of neighborhood resources, what kind of cooling centers do we need to be thinking about to make sure that we survive those hot days as best we can? Storms are another big issue in Buffalo. When you think about climate change and storms, you might think about hurricanes and tropical storms, but it's also a big deal in Buffalo due to lake effect snow. Some of you may have heard we do get lake effect snow occasionally in Buffalo. Well, ironically, the warmer temperatures mean that we have less and less ice cover on Lake Erie, which means we're actually more vulnerable to lake effect snowstorms. And we've had some huge ones in recent years. And when I was a kid, we prayed for snow days. We had very elaborate rituals that we used to conduct, hoping that there'd be a big storm and we wouldn't have to go to school. And there is a tradition in Buffalo of kind of embracing the storms. But of course, they're also extremely dangerous. And of course, they also hurt the most vulnerable residents the most. When you lose power and you can't afford to go out and buy a generator, when you lose power and you miss work, when you lose power and you're already frail due to the environmental health concerns that you have in your life, storms can be deadly or very damaging to you. So as we think about the housing of the future, we also have to think about storm resiliency. And what are we going to do to help homes and neighborhoods survive big lake effect storms and big other kinds of storms? One of the problems that always strikes me as solvable but really difficult right now is that when you lose power, you lose heat. And it doesn't really take that much heat. It doesn't take that much power to run a furnace or a boiler. But if you have no power, then you lack heat. So suddenly you have a big snowstorm in Buffalo and you have all these homes without heat, a health emergency. What are the ways that we can make sure that people still get heat? I have a friend who ran his boiler from his car engine. He ran the car in the driveway and hooked that up to his boiler, and that worked. But how many people can use that strategy? So those are some of the things that we're thinking about when we think about climate change impacts and housing in Buffalo. This intersection of climate change and housing, it makes sense to focus a lot of attention on it in a place like Buffalo. Our residential sector is our biggest source of greenhouse gas emissions. It accounts for 34% of greenhouse gas emissions in the city of Buffalo. Bigger than industry, bigger than transportation, residential. But it's also a very punishing cost center for people with low incomes. who cannot afford their homes and who are subject to environmental conditions like the lead paint poisoning that we talked about yesterday. Buffalo has significantly higher lead poisoning ratios than Flint, Michigan. So when Flint was in the news, a lot of people in Buffalo thought, wow, we have a much worse lead poisoning problem here, and nobody is flying in to help us with it. How do we raise this issue to the level that it deserves? We have the sixth most racially segregated housing patterns in the country as a metro region. We're eighth most segregated by income. We have over 5,000 people experiencing homelessness each year in Erie County. We have some of the oldest housing stock in the nation. So this intersection of climate and racial and economic justice is very real to us in Buffalo. And it's not just a question of those impacts coming in the future that I mentioned, but it's also a question of the realities that people are living through now. So if you think about how our housing patterns affect the lives of people in Buffalo, think about the segregation by economics and by race. Think about where people are living. They're in that old housing stock with the lead paint. They're near the highways that are producing the bad air quality. They're near the industrial sources that are producing the bad air quality. The fact that we sprawled out into the suburbs for decades, even while we were losing population, who did that hurt the most? Well, the vacant and abandoned housing stock that are left is in the inner city, in the heavily minority neighborhoods. The increased distance between jobs and housing affects people without cars the most. The lack of good sources of fresh food, of full-service grocery stores in the food deserts in Buffalo is amplified by these patterns of racial and economic segregation. So already, people in Buffalo are feeling this sort of environmental injustice that relates very directly to housing. And it's hard for them to organize against it. Is that the 2-minute? It's hard for them to organize against it because they're busy dealing with the day-to-day problems that it creates. So that's what we're fighting against. What are we fighting for? A green, just economy. And one of the wonderful advantages we have in Buffalo is that if you come to visit us, we can show you a neighborhood where it's being realized. And Aaron Bartley was here yesterday. His organization, Push Buffalo, is the group that really led the creation of what's called the Green Development Zone in Buffalo. If you come to Buffalo, I'll take you to Niagara Falls, but I'll also take you to the Green Development Zone because it's the thing that I think is most impressive about Buffalo in the last 10 years. Many cities have redone their waterfronts. Many cities have artisanal cocktails in their downtown now. Not many cities have a Green Development Zone. It's a 25-block area that suffered tremendously from vacant and abandoned housing. It had hundreds of vacant units in it, very high poverty rates, very unsustainable. And what Push and its allies have done is focused resources on a 25-block area. They've created over 100 units of green affordable housing. They've greened over 100 vacant lots. They've worked with the city to renovate a public park. They have created the state's first community solar array that is owned by people with low incomes, including renters, all within this 25-block area green development zone. And the way that they did that is equally as important as the results because it started with community organizing and community planning. So Push is one of the few groups in the country that renovated the kind of 1960s housing organization style where you combine organizing and advocacy with community redevelopment. And so when the neighbors said, our number one problem is vacant housing, Push looked into it and found out who owned this vacant housing. And as Aaron mentioned briefly, it was actually controlled by an obscure state agency that had facilitated the purchase and securitization of tax foreclosure liens. Very weird setup. But Push found out that's what had happened, did the advocacy to get those housing units put back into the city's hands and available for reuse. And then they started reusing some of those properties. So that combination of organizing, community planning, finding out what people want, helping them do it, but then actually doing the development on the ground turned out to be incredibly potent. So that's a model that we're incredibly excited about. We think it's the model for the future in many ways. It's a small neighborhood, and it has to be careful not to be the victim of its own success. So when you fix up a neighborhood, you invite gentrification. But the strategy that's working there reasonably well is you get in early and you get control of a lot of property while it's still cheap. And then you essentially land bank that or hold that so that you can keep it permanently affordable. And when you do those renovations, you hire neighborhood residents. So you're helping their incomes and not just their neighborhood. So you kind of avoid that problem of do you fix up a place or do you help the people? There are ways to do both. And Push has found some very innovative ways to do it. So happy to talk more about it later and happy to give you the tour when you come to Buffalo. Thank you.